Hey all, welcome. You're listening to The Stoned Narrator, where the curious, the creepy, and the unexplained come to life. Now get your bowl, bud, and your drink. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Now let's get into today's story. Ghost Train by S.E. Schlosser. You mean to tell me, I asked the station master, that you really believe that a train has a ghost? And that ghostly trains run on actual railways at night? If you were railroading, replied my friend, you'd see the foolishness of asking such a question. Do I believe in ghost trains? You might as well ask me if I believed in Pullman cars. Why, man, every railroadman knows that ghost trains are liable to be met with almost any night. I don't say that they're common, but I do say that there are lots of men who have seen them, and have just as much reason for believing in them as they have for believing in any regular train. Have you yourself seen a ghost train? I asked. The station master chewed his cigar for a moment in silence and said, "Seeing it's you that asked me, I'll tell you something that I haven't told any man for more than 10 years. Unless he happened to be an experienced railroadman. You see, I got tired of having people doubt my word and insinuate that I was a lunatic or had been drinking too much whiskey. You'll perhaps think the same, but what I'm going to tell you is a cold fact. And there ain't a bit of line, or poetry, or political argufying, or any of those sort of imaginative things about it. You know the road here from Tibber Center? It's pretty near a straight line. But when I first came to these parts, these trains used to run from here to Tibber Center by a mighty roundabout way. The line, as it was originally laid out, ran in some sort of semicircle, taking in half a dozen small towns lying northwest of this place. After a while, the company surveyed the new line and bored the big tunnel through Blue Eagle Mountain. The old line wasn't entirely abandoned until about 2 years ago, but after that tunnel was finished, there was only one passenger train each way daily, and a freight train 3 times a week. I had a brother who lived up in Manlius, a town on the old line, about 70 miles from here. Well, that is to say, Manlius was his post office address, but he lived in a house that was 3 miles from the station, and there wasn't any town of Manlius except the station house and a little shanty that used to be used as a post office, I believe. I was kind of a general assistant at the Thrishyer station where we are now, and there not being much work on hand, I got 2 days leave and took the train up to see my brother. It was about a year after the new line had been opened, and as the company meant to abandon the old line, they hadn't put any repairs on worth speaking of, and it was the roughest road you've ever traveled over. I was a little scared of myself, though. As a rule, I never troubled myself about railroad accidents, knowing they're bound to come, and you can't help yourself. There had been a terrible accident on that very road just before the expresses quit running over it. A train, with a Pullman car full of passengers, went off the track just as she had struck the bridge over the Muscahooit River. And as the bridge was over 60 feet high, and the river was over 20 feet deep, nobody ever saw a hide or hair of that train, or anybody connected with it, from that day to this. Well, I got up to my brother's along around 8 or maybe half 8 o'clock in the evening, and I found him gone away and the house locked up. I hammered on the doors and tried the windows till I had settled that there was no one at home, and that I couldn't break in. And then I just meandered back to the station, calculating to pass the night in a woodshed and take the train back to Jericho the next day. It had been snowing hard, and there was near a foot of snow on the level, let alone the big drifts that were here and there. I was pretty well fagged out when I got to the station, which of course was shut up for the night, and if it hadn't been that I had a quart flask of whiskey in my pocket, I should have come near freezing to death. I went to the woodshed and got round behind the wood, where the wind couldn't reach me, and after cussing my brother for a spell, on account of this having gone off and shut his house up, I made preparations for taking a nap. But just then I heard the rumble of a train. This naturally astonished me, knowing as I did exactly what trains were running on that road, and that there wasn't any sort of train due at the station for the next 15 hours. However, the train kept coming nearer and nearer, and pretty soon I heard the grinding of the brakes, and understood that the train was coming to a stop. I didn't lose any time in getting out of that woodshed and going for that train. I could see it standing close to the water butt, about 50 yards down the road, and knew, of course, that the engineer was taking in water. When I reached there, I saw that the train consisted of only a baggage car and a Pullman sleeper. I swung myself up on the rear platform of the sleeper and pushed the door open with a good deal of trouble. for the woodwork seemed to have swelled. There wasn't anybody to help me from inside the car. When I got inside, I looked around for the passengers, but there wasn't a single one. Neither was there any sign of the porter, who ought to be there asking me for my ticket, and to pretend that I was making him a lot of trouble for asking for a bid. The car was lit up after a fashion by a single oil lamp, and all the berths looked as if the passengers had just jumped out of them, and the porter hadn't been around to make up the beds. I couldn't think of what had become of the passengers, seeing as they couldn't have gone into the baggage car, and it didn't seem probable that a whole car full could have just distributed themselves at way stations. However, that wasn't any affair of mine. I opened both doors of the car to let a little air to blow through, for it was as musty as a bar room when you open it for the first time in the morning. Then I picked out a good berth and calculated to turn in for the night. I soon found that those berths weren't fit for any Christian to sleep in, for the bedclothes were as damp as if they had been out left in a rainstorm. Where the water had come from that had soaked them, I couldn't imagine, for it hadn't rained for any of a week. And it stood to reason that the snow couldn't have drifted into the car, shut up as tight as it was. Then it puzzled me to imagine why the porter hadn't taken the wet clothes away. The whole business was enough to throw a man off his balance, and I gave up thinking about it. And going into the washroom, I sat down in the wash basin, which was the only dry seat in the car, and leaning up against the corner, tried to take a nap. By this time, the train had left the station several miles behind, and was running at a rate that I knew had been risky on any road, let alone as rough of a road as the one that we were on. At first I didn't mind this, the running of the train not being my business, but pretty soon I found that I could not keep my seat without holding on with both hands. I've been in cars that have done some pretty tall running, and over some mighty rough roads, but I've never before or since knew a car to jump and roll and shake herself generally as that car did. I began to think that the engineer was either drunk or crazy, and that the passengers had got so scared that they all just left the train. To tell the truth, I would have been glad to have left the train myself. I was never fond of jumping. There'd be any man that liked to say jump from a train that is doing 40, 50 miles an hour. Well, I just don't believe him. All of a sudden I thought of the bell cord, and I decided that I would pull it and stop the train. Then if any conductor appeared, I would tell him who I was, and inform him that if he did not make this engineer run the train in a decent way, I would take good care that the division superintendent should know about the whole thing. So I got a hold of the bell cord and gave it a fairish sort of pull. Not the very hardest sort of pull, you understand, but just a moderate pull. The cord broke in my hand as easy as if it had been a piece of thread, and all chance of stopping that train that way just disappeared. I looked at the bell cord, saw it was as rotten as a politician's conscience, so I just broke off a piece of it, about 2 or 3 yards long, and just put it in my pocket, intending to show it to the division superintendent as a specimen of the way in which the Pullman car conductors attended their business. All the time the train was rushing at a speed that would have been counted worth noticing, even on the New York Central. While she struck a curve, and there were a lot of them, she just left the track entirely and swung around that curve with her wheels in the air. And when she did strike that track again, you bet that thing shook. Of course, I don't mean that the train actually did leave the track, but that was the way that it would have seemed to you if you had been aboard that car. I went to the forward door to see if there was any chance of getting into or over the baggage car, and so reaching the engineer. But it would have taken a squirrel in first-rate training to have climbed over that baggage car without breaking his neck at the rate in which we were running. I went back into the sleeper again, and holding on to a berth, tried to light up a cigar, but somehow the match didn't even seem to take much interest in the thing. I felt confident that in a few minutes more than the car would leave the track and go to everlasting smash. And I remember feeling thankful that I had gone over my accounts just before leaving Jericho, and that nobody could fail to understand them. Just then I thought of the brake. Should I go out on the platform and put the brake on? The engineer would feel the drag on the car and it would stop the train, unless he was stark mad. At any rate, the thing was worth trying. I go out onto the platform, hanging on for all that it was worth on the handrail, until I got a hold of the brake wheel. It was rusty as if it had been soaking in water for a week. I didn't mind that. I jammed the brake down good and hard, but the brake chain almost snapped as easy as the bell cord, and there was an end of that plan from stopping the train. Of course, I knew the brake chain sometimes snaps, and you can't prevent it, but it was curious that both the bell cord and the brake chain on that car should have been good for nothing. Well, I got back into the car again, and I took a middling good drink of that whiskey, and it was sort of warmed up my courage. I never was a drinking man, even in my young days, for I despise a drunkard, especially if he's a railroadman. But I hadn't had above 6 or 7 drinks that day, and I knew that another moderate one wouldn't do me any harm. I was beginning to feel a little better when I remembered that I never heard the whistle of the locomotive since we started from Analyst Station. That showed me that the engineer wasn't drunk or mad, for in either case he would have blown his whistle for about 2/3 of the time, there being nothing that a crazy man or a drunken engineer finds as soothing as a steam whistle. I couldn't explain our flying around the curves or over level crossings without sounding the whistle, except on the theory that the engineer had dropped dead in his cab. But then there would have been the firemen. Both of the men couldn't very well have died at the same time, same minute. And if there was anything the matter with the engineer, the fireman would have naturally either stopped the train or tried to get help. Or he would have had to run it very cautiously, that not being his usual business, and would have been very particular about whistling at the proper places. Not hearing the whistle was, on the whole, more astonishing to me than finding a Pullman car without a passenger, or without a porter, and with the bedclothes soaked with water, and the bell cord almost too rotten to bear its own weight. There wasn't a thing to be seen through the car windows, for they were thick with dirt, so wanting to get some idea of the locality that we just got to, I went out to the rear platform again, and getting down on the lower step, I leaned out to have a look all around. Just then we started around another curve, and with my fingers being a little numb, and with what that swaying of the car, I lost my hold, and was shot off that train like a mailbag that is chucked onto our platform when the public express goes zooming by. Luckily I fell into a snowbank and wasn't seriously hurt. However, the shock stunned me for a while, and when I came to and had found that I had broken no bones, and that my skull was all right, I picked myself up and started to wank down the track till I should come to a house. After walking, as I should judge about half a mile, I came to the East Fayetteville, where there's a little tavern, and mighty glad I was to see it. I knocked the landlord up and got to bed, and it was noon the next day before I woke up. There wasn't any train to Jericho until after 3 o'clock, so not having anything to do, I looked up the landlord and found he was an old acquaintance of mine by the name of Hank Simons. When I told him that I had come to Fayetteville by night train, he sort of smiled, and I could see he didn't believe me. "I don't say that the train stopped here," I said. "For the last I saw, I was on a mile or so up the road, where I fell off the rear platform into a snowbank, but all the same. I did come most of the way from a Manilus last night in a Pullman sleeper." "And then you must have come on what the boys call the ghost train," said Hank. "What train's that?" said I. "Why, it's the ghost of the train that went off the bridge over Mascahoot River. The boys do say that every once in a while there's a train made up of a locomotive, a baggage car, and a Pullman sleeper that come down the road a-hustling. And off go the Mascahoot Bridge into the river. I never saw no such train myself. There's lots of folks living along this road that have seen it, and you'd have hard work to convince them that there isn't a ghost of the wrecked train. Come to think of it, that there was a train wrecked just a year ago last night, and it's probably that or ghost just out here airing out, you might say." Well, when it come to think of it over, I came to the conclusion that Hank was right, and that the Pullman with the wet bedclothes and the rotten bell cord was nothing more or less than the ghost of a car. However, I didn't say much more to Hank about it at the time, for the less of a man talks about seeing ghosts, the better it is for him. If he wants to be considered a reliable man, that is. But as soon as I got back to Jericho, I went to see the division superintendent, and I told him the whole story. "See here," he said, when I got through, "I suppose I ought to report to you, but considering that you were not on duty last night, and that you're not a drinking man as a general thing, I shan't say anything about it. But if you'll take my advice, you'll not tell that ridiculous story to anyone else." "Then you think I was drunk and dreamed up the whole thing, do you?" I asked. "I don't think so," he said. "I'm sure of it. I've just been over the division reports, and ain't no such train you described have been seen on any station. Besides, I know where every Pullman car in the company's service is at this identical time, and it's impossible that a Pullman car should have been on the Manilus branch last night. Nope, no train of any kind went over that branch between 8 o'clock last night and 7 o'clock this morning." Then I wish you'd explain how I traveled from Manilus Station to East Fabulous last night between 9 and 12. I can prove by the conductor of the up train that he left me off at Manilus after 8 o'clock last night, and I can prove by the landlord of the Fabulous Tavern that I pulled up at that house just before 12 o'clock. A man, whether he is drunk or sober, can't travel 70 miles in 3 hours, unless he does it on a railroad train. The superintendent was a mighty smart man, but this conundrum of mine was more than he could answer. So only smiled in an aggravating sort of way, and said, "You better take my advice and keep quiet. You know how the directors are in any man that drinks too much whiskey. And if you go on talking about this adventure of yours, the chances are you'll lose your place." And just then I happened to think of that piece of bell cord that I had taken from the car. I put my hand in my pocket, and there it was. Sure enough, I held it up and said to the superintendent, "This is a piece of rotten bell cord that I told you about. Perhaps you'll say I dreamed 6 feet of cord into my pocket." The superintendent took it, and I could see that he was some considerable staggered. "You say you got this out of the Pullman sleeper that you dreamed about?" he asked. "That's exactly and precisely the identical place where I got that cord," says I, as solemn as I was on my oath. "Well," says he, "I take back what I said about your having been drunk. That there cord hasn't been used in any car on this road for more than a year. The last car that had a cord like that was the one that went into the Muscahoo River. That's a cotton cord. We don't use anything but hemp nowadays." "Then you think I was on a ghost train after all?" says I. "I think," says he, "that the less you say about it, the better. That is, if you care to follow my advice. If you keep on talking about it, you'll have half the trainmen on the division watching ghosts and neglecting their regular duties." Of course, I promised to do as the superintendent said, and I never mentioned the ghost train until this particular superintendent had skipped to Canada with over $100,000. He was a most amazing smart man, and if I had gone against his wishes, I wouldn't have stayed in the company service very long. However, I did begin to tell the story. Nobody believed me, except now and then an old train hand who had seen the ghost train himself and knew all about him. I've told you this story as straight as I die, and you can take it or leave it as you choose. As Horace says, there's more things in heaven and the other place than any philosopher ever dared to dream about. Alright, all. Thanks for hanging out with me, the Stone Narrator. Don't forget to drop a like, comment, subscribe for more stories. If you have a story of your own and you would like me to narrate it, drop me a message. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and try to not become the subject of the next story.